I could feel the heat rising as Austin's words, "Your coding standards are outdated. It's time for someone who understands modern architecture." My colleagues averted their eyes as if witnessing someone's public execution. 15 years of dedication reduced to a single humiliating dismissal in front of the entire engineering team at Netspan Analytics. Despite Austin's well-groomed fingernails tapping impatiently on the wood, I maintained a neutral expression as the termination paper slid across the polished oak table toward me. Rather than objecting, I just nodded, picked up the document, and got up from my seat. "Geraldine," Austin asked, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" in a tone that was brimming with phony concern for our benefit. Audience: "No, thank you for the opportunity." I said this in a steady voice despite my hands shaking. I collected my belongings, turned on my heel, and left the conference room with my head held high. My name is Geraldine Knox, and I am 53 years old. Up until 20 minutes ago, I was the senior software architect at Netspan Analytics in Columbus, Ohio, where I have been the backbone of this operation for 15 years. When I packed my belongings into a cardboard box, memories of working late into the night to debug critical systems, weekend work sessions to meet impossible deadlines, and the innumerable innovations that had transformed a struggling startup into a powerhouse in the SAS came flooding back. Developing the custom database framework that powers everything from client data warehousing to analytics delivery for hundreds of enterprise clients. Every item I put in the box symbolized years of commitment to a business I supported. Douglas, one of the junior developers I had coached, lingered awkwardly by my desk. "This isn't right, Geraldine. They can't just..." "It's okay," I said gently. "But your database architecture is the backbone of everything we do here." He glanced over his shoulder in order to make sure Austin wasn't in earshot. I smiled, a sincere one this time. Yes, it is what Austin Merrick didn't know, that I had created Netspan's proprietary database structure under a separate consulting agreement during the company's early years. At the time, they couldn't afford to hire me full-time, so we set up a contract that made it clear that I would keep the licensing rights to the architecture unless it was bought outright, which never happened. As I approached the elevator box, I felt strangely at ease because I had constructed Netspan's foundation piece by piece, and Austin was going to discover what happens when you remove a cornerstone without first making sure it is load-bearing. Analytics back in 2008, when James Holloway approached me with his idea for a groundbreaking data analytics platform. The company was run by 3 individuals out of a remodeled garage, and James had the business idea, but he needed someone who could create a database architecture that could handle enormous data sets and deliver lightning-fast results. "I know your work from Travant Corporation, so you're exactly what we need." We drafted a consulting agreement that allowed me to develop the database architecture while maintaining my intellectual property rights, as stated in paragraph 17, subsection C, Fast Analytics. "We can't afford to hire you full-time, but James had acknowledged during our first meeting that I retained full licensing rights to the underlying framework unless Netspan specifically purchased those rights. James readily agreed to this clause, but as Netspan expanded, that promise waned. Series of funding came and went, followed by Series B and a successful IPO. James eventually became chairman of the board, leaving day-to-day operations to AASI. Loved my job. I expanded and improved the database architecture over the years, making it a seamless system that handled everything from data ingestion to visualization. My work became so integrated into the company's archives that the licensing agreement was forgotten by everyone but me. A succession of CEOs who were unaware of my arrangement. Then, 6 months ago, Austin Merrick arrived, bringing a wave of disruption with him. At 34, he was the youngest director of engineering in the company's history, hired from a hip Silicon Valley startup with promises of modernizing our legacy systems. Few people realized how deeply my code was ingrained in every aspect of Netspan's operations. He constantly used buzzwords in meetings, such as microservices, blockchain integration, and serverless architecture, while dismissing the reliable systems that had been serving our clients for years. His mantra was, "We need to pivot toward a more agile framework," but he never explained what that meant. I attempted to work with him by outlining the elegant complexity of our database structure and how it might be changed without running the risk of a total overhaul, but Austin interpreted my hesitancy as resistance and my experience as stubbornness. In his eyes, I stood for the status quo and stood in the way of his reform vision. The tech industry waits for no one, Geraldine, he told me in our most recent one-on-one meeting, hardly raising his head. When he walked through Netspan's doors, the house felt unusually quiet. I never thought he would make the decision for me, but maybe it was inevitable. When I got home that afternoon, I put my box of belongings on the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of wine, and then settled into my favorite armchair to process what had just happened. I was not prepared to respond, so I opened my laptop and navigated to my personal cloud storage where I kept copies of all my important documents. The 2008 consulting agreement was right where I'd left it. In less than 15 minutes, 15 years of my professional life had come to an end. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from worried colleagues expressing their shock and support. I read the contract again, verifying what I already knew, along with the thorough documentation of my contributions to intellectual property over the years. The licensing provisions were drafted by a lawyer who specialized in technology intellectual property, and Section 29 states that if my employment were to end, the company would have 30 days to either buy the full license or negotiate continued use of the mechanism was laid out in the technical specifications I had submitted to Netspan years prior, but I had my doubts. Without either action, the system would automatically switch back to evaluation mode, restricting functionality until licensing was resolved. I had built this failsafe into the core framework, not as a trap, but as protection for a scenario I hoped would never occur. James Holloway's name appeared on my phone when it rang, and I hesitated before answering. Geraldine. What the hell happened? Patricia in Human Resources told me that James and I had drifted apart over the years as he concentrated on board-level responsibilities, but we still kept a friendly relationship. Austin decided my services were no longer required. I said. James muttered, "That's absolute nonsense," in response to my neutral response that my coding standards were outdated. Did you remind him about the licensing agreement? No, I didn't. He made his decision in front of the entire team, and it didn't seem like the right time to bring up contract details. There was a long pause. Geraldine. You understand the implications. For the business, which I do better than anyone else. What are you going to do? I took a sip of wine and thought about my response, but James, nothing at all. The system will do exactly what it was designed to do when the licensing verification runs on Saturday, so I'm just going to let things happen organically. Austin has no idea, he never asked, and he has never reviewed the James side heavily. This is going to be a disaster, and I agreed. His first big move is scheduled for Saturday morning, a system-wide update that he claims will revolutionize our processing capabilities. He never met with anyone who understood the foundation of the systems he's so eager to replace, so I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. Definitely will be. After hanging up, I sat quietly and watched the sunset through my living room window. I was extremely disappointed that it had come to this point. I woke up early this Saturday morning, even though I had nowhere to be, because 15 years of 6 o'clock alarms had trained my body to rise with the sun no matter what. I made coffee and brought my laptop to the kitchen table so that I wouldn't have to check on Netspan. I didn't have to, but I updated my resume at exactly 7 a.m. Austin's planned system update would start at 7:30 a.m. When the weekly licensing verification check ran, Netspan's whole platform would crash, no data queries, client dashboards, or reports, just a basic since the error message was intentionally generic and meant to look like a routine system check rather than a licensing enforcement mechanism. I wondered how long it would take them to figure out what went wrong. Technical logs would provide more detailed information, but would anyone at Netspan know where to look at 7:45 a.m.? When my phone rang, the caller ID displayed Douglas's number, Geraldine. I'm glad you answered, because we're in full meltdown mode right now. His voice was strained, and the background noise suggested chaos. I asked, pretending not to know, and Austin pushed his major update this morning. Now, the entire system is down, every client is receiving error messages, and the support lines are congested. I'm sorry, Douglas. I'm no longer with NetSpan, so? I can't help. My tone was firm but gentle, but you built this system, and you're the only one, Douglas, so I interrupted you. I see that he's got everyone looking through your documentation, but no one understands it like you do. You can trust me on that. After hanging up, I took a deep breath. I felt bad for the junior developers, like Douglas, who were caught in the crossfire, but they would survive this storm. By 9 a.m., the calls were coming in more frequently, and I let most of them go to voicemail, but I answered when I saw James' number. The board was calling an emergency meeting. Without providing a preamble, he stated that Austin was attempting to portray this as a catastrophic failure of your database architecture rather than a licensing issue. I asked, nobody has figured that out yet, and they're still treating it as a technical failure. I nodded to myself. They will eventually, he said. For those who are aware of where to look, Geraldine, what do you hope to gain from this? What is your ultimate goal? I carefully thought about his question, and I did consider acknowledgement, respect, compensation for years of work that was not valued, and yes, a formal apology for how I was fired. I will make sure that your terms are presented to the board. By noon, my email inbox was filled with frantic messages from almost every executive at Austin himself and NetSpan. Both sent a particularly telling message. Anything you did to sabotage our systems, we will hold you legally responsible. This kind of vindictive action is exactly why we needed to move past your antiquated methods. Instead of responding, I got in touch with Patricia Winters, a technology attorney I had previously consulted when drafting the original. Within an hour, she had gone over the contract and verified what I already knew to be true. They have nothing to defend. Patricia reassured me that your licensing rights are clearly protected and that the termination clause is very clear. If anything, they could face legal repercussions for using your intellectual property without permission. Yes, Thomas, it's a licensing issue. The CTO finally called after your termination by 2 p.m., and his voice was a mix of resignation and realization. The emergency board meeting continued until long after midnight, and I knew this because James texted me updates throughout the evening. Growing more and more irate as the hours passed, Austin continued to deny responsibility. Legal counsel confirmed the validity of your contract. The CFO calculated potential losses of 7 figures per day. Austin suggested legal action against you, and that was immediately shot down. The final text arrived at 12:43 a.m., and the board wants your terms should be prepared appropriately tomorrow. I worked with Patricia on Sunday morning to draft a thorough proposal, being careful not to come across as vengeful or opportunistic. This was not about extortion but rather just fair recompense for my professional dignity and intellectual property. The terms were simple. I would receive $750,000 in back payments for the unlicensed use of my database architecture since termination. 2. A 2-year consulting retainer at $200,000 per year to guarantee a seamless transition and transfer of knowledge. 3. Full ownership of my intellectual property to be formally acknowledged. And 4. A public apology from the board for my improper dismissal. Patricia assured me that this is completely reasonable. If you're undervaluing anything, please review the document. The board sent me as their representative, and when I invited Thomas Lane, NetSpan's CTO, inside, he explained that they thought I might be more welcome than others. We sat in my living room when my doorbell rang at 2:00 p.m., and I was shocked to see him standing on my porch looking uneasy. Although we had never been close, Thomas had been with NetSpan for nearly as long as I had. He had always been more concerned with hardware infrastructure, while I was in charge of database architecture. I want to personally apologize for his discomfort, which became apparent when Austin started to push for your termination. I should have intervened when Austin started to push for your termination because I understood the importance of your. He nodded, reaching into his briefcase to retrieve a folder. The board has reviewed your terms and is ready to accept them with one modification. He slid a document across the coffee table. I appreciated his candor, but I remained cautious. Thank you for that, Thomas. I was surprised by the higher offer and the other terms accepted as presented, including the public apology. They would like to issue it tomorrow morning if possible. And they are offering $2 million for the back payment instead of $750,000, acknowledging that your initial figure was actually fairly conservative given the potential damages. We have already lost a number of significant accounts, and more are threatening to leave if service isn't restored by morning. The board has requested Austin Thomas's explanation for the uncomfortably shifting rush, Thomas. Every minute our systems are down costs us about $40,000 in lost revenue and potential client damages. James was very vocal about holding him accountable, and I nodded with a complex mixture of satisfaction and regret. I had never wanted anyone to lose their job, I just wanted proper recognition for my own contributions. What happens now? I asked if you would sign this agreement I have. My resignation is effective immediately. His decisions caused this crisis. And his attempts to blame you later only made it worse. Thomas smiled wearily. You haven't slept, have you? I looked at his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. The technical team had probably been working non-stop since Saturday morning. Instructions to immediately implement the licensing key you provide. We can have systems back online within the hour. When I arrived at NetSpan headquarters on Monday morning, not as a disgraced former employee but as a valued consultant, I felt a genuine sense of pride because your architecture is remarkably secure. We've tried every possible work environment, but the atmosphere was noticeably different, with faces avoiding eye contact. Word spreads quickly in tech companies, and everyone knew what had happened over the weekend. The systems were restored Sunday evening after I gave the required licensing validation codes, and the board's formal apology was distributed company-wide at 8 a.m., acknowledging my invaluable. It was carefully worded to avoid admitting legal wrongdoing while still giving me the recognition I deserved. I was taken to the executive conference room where the board members were gathered for a special meeting. And James gave me a firm handshake before directing me to a seat that had been set up at the top of the list of contributions to NetSpan's core technology. I believe most of you have met Geraldine Knox, our most important consultant and the architect of our core database framework. She has kindly agreed to assist us in moving to a sustainable knowledge management system over the next 2 years, and several board members nodded through a gesture at the head of the table that I found symbolic. Before we talk about what to do next, James went on, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the entire board for what happened. We failed in our oversight responsibilities and allowed a valuable opportunity to be destroyed. A few couldn't quite meet my eyes, but I knew they were the ones who had most enthusiastically supported Austin's modernization initiatives without knowing what they were dismantling. Geraldine, the floor is yours, he said, turning to me after mistreating a teammate. The remarks came naturally to me even though I hadn't planned a speech. I had spent 15 years creating a system that would expand over time and be able to adjust to shifting demands while still being incredibly reliable. I never opposed innovation or modernization, instead, I opposed irresponsible the board members. Listened carefully as I went on, explaining that my goal today is not to dwell on past mistakes but to create a path forward. The database architecture requires documentation that others can understand and a succession plan, and yes, it needs updating, but it should be done so gradually rather than drastically. The CEO, who had prudently remained silent during Austin's campaign against me, approached with a somewhat chastened expression as the meeting came to an end. I had presented my vision for NetSpan's technical future, explaining how the current architecture could be improved without being replaced, how younger developers could be trained to maintain and extend it, and how we could incorporate new technologies without abandoning what worked. We've learned a painful lesson about the importance of institutional knowledge. He acknowledged that sometimes the longest-serving employee isn't a hindrance to advancement, in fact, they're crucial to it. I nodded, acknowledging that the best Systems combine both experience and innovation. Later that afternoon, I ran into Douglas in the break room, and his face brightened. I smiled and said, "You're back." I heard you were consulting, but I'm back in a manner of speaking," and he lowered his voice. "Everyone's talking about what happened, but Austin really had no idea about the licensing agreement. He never bothered to ask, never took the time to understand the foundation before trying to replace." Douglas shook his head, disbelieving. "That's wow, I can't imagine being that arrogant." "It happens more often than you'd think," I said. "The tech industry sometimes values novelty over substance. New isn't always better, sometimes it's just new." 6 months into my consulting agreement, NetSpan was thriving again, client confidence had been restored, and the technical team was stronger than ever with a renewed appreciation for one another. As I made my way back toward my temporary office, I thought back on the events that had brought me here and realized that sometimes the quietest coding contains the most powerful safeguards. Documentation and knowledge exchange. Vanessa Wright, Austin's replacement, was a practical leader who appreciated both innovation and stability, which was a welcome departure from her predecessor's careless style. I had set up an extensive training program for the younger developers to make sure my knowledge wouldn't be isolated, and Douglas had demonstrated a special aptitude for database comprehension. Following the conclusion of my consulting period, the board had maintained a respectful distance, allowing me to work without interference and making it clear that my expertise was valued. James periodically checked in, gradually rekindling our old friendship as we worked together on long-term strategic planning on a Wednesday afternoon. Patricia from Human Resources, who had handled my termination papers 6 months prior, made an unexpected visit to my office. "I brought you something," and she placed a manila envelope on my desk, saying it was a formal document from legal acknowledging my intellectual property rights to the database architecture, which is now officially licensed to NetSpan under the. It contained a personal note from the CEO expressing our sincere gratitude for your contributions and our apologies for not recognizing them sooner. It was not just a legal document, it was confirmation of 15 years of work and innumerable late nights and weekends given up to create something. The terms we had negotiated were signed by all board members. As I ran my fingers over the company's embossed seal, I was reminded of the time when NetSpan was just 3 people in a garage with a big dream. "Thank you, Patricia." She nodded, realizing the gravity of the situation. "After everything that happened, many people expected you to be different and possibly vengeful." I smiled and said, "I never wanted revenge, I just wanted respect." As Patricia departed, I carefully placed the document in my portfolio. The victory wasn't in bringing NetSpan to its knees, but rather in making it stronger. A year after my public dismissal, I was giving a keynote speech at the Ohio Technology Leadership Summit. It was called Building Sustainable Systems, the Human Element in Software Architecture, and I wasn't unaware of the irony that I had been invited because of how the NetSpan case had been handled. It served as a warning to tech management circles about the importance of valuing experienced engineers rather than quickly replacing them with younger, ostensibly more. The story was covered by a number of industry publications, but NetSpan wisely declined to comment beyond their public apology. As I finished speaking, the audience of executives and technology professionals enthusiastically applauded. During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand and said, "Your database architecture saved NetSpan from collapse. However, by freely sharing your knowledge, you're actively teaching others how to preserve and eventually replace it. Isn't that undermining your own power?" It was a thought-provoking question that got to the core of what many people misinterpreted about my actions. Knowledge isn't power when it's hoarded. I responded that it's power when it's properly valued, something I never wanted to be. Irreplaceable. I wanted the systems I created to be recognized and valued. The real failure at NetSpan wasn't the conceit of a single director, but rather a culture that made important information enigmatic rather than recorded and disseminated. Following the summit, a number of businesses extended consulting offers to me, including 2 of NetSpan's biggest rivals, which I graciously turned down. The truth was more nuanced, and I explained that I was dedicated to finishing my current engagement. My goal had never been to maximize profit but rather to restore professional dignity. That evening, I received an email from Vanessa Wright with the straightforward subject line, "Thank you for rebuilding bridges instead of burning them." As I thought about it, I realized that I discovered during my path from shame to validation that the most satisfying retaliation did not result in destruction, but the process of creating a legacy that would survive the crisis and the victory.